Something deeply serious is about to hit the United States. And what is most disturbing is that most Americans have no real idea of what is coming. They do not see it because they do not want to see it, because the media rarely shows it, and because the propaganda of American exceptionalism has convinced them that their country is somehow protected from the basic laws of history and economics. But let me tell you this with the clarity that comes from decades of study. No empire is immune, not a single one. And the United States will not be an exception. I have spent more than 50 years of my life studying economic systems, financial crises, and the rise and fall of great powers. I have gone through historical records, examined hard data, and watched patterns repeat themselves with almost mathematical accuracy. What I see today in the United States worries me more than anything else I have seen in my entire career. Not because it is new, but precisely because it is old. It is the same pattern that has appeared again and again before the collapse of every empire that once ruled the world. The idea I want to share with you today is simple, but it is also devastating. The United States is facing at least 7 major structural crises at the same time. Any one of these crises on its own could be managed, but together they form a perfect storm that the current political and economic system simply cannot fix. The reason most people do not see what is coming is because each crisis is discussed separately, as if it were an isolated issue. In reality, they are all connected. They are not separate problems, but symptoms of a much deeper and more dangerous systemic disease. Let me start with what should be the most obvious issue, even though it is strangely one of the least honestly discussed, the national debt. As I speak, the debt of the United States is over $34 trillion. 34 trillion is such an enormous number that it becomes meaningless to the average person. So let me put it in terms you can actually feel. If you divided that debt among every American citizen, including newborn babies, each person would owe more than $100,000. A family of 4 would owe over $400,000 in federal debt alone. And that is before mortgages, before student loans, before credit card debt. But here is the part almost no one truly understands. The real problem is not just the size of the debt. The real danger is how fast it is growing, and even more importantly, how expensive it has become to maintain. For many years, the United States could borrow money with very few consequences because interest rates were extremely low. Borrowing was almost free. It was like having a credit card with 0% interest. You could keep adding debt because the cost of carrying it was small. That era is over, and it ended in a dramatic way. The Federal Reserve, trying to control inflation that it helped create by printing trillions of dollars during the pandemic, raised interest rates to levels not seen in decades. Suddenly, the debt that once looked manageable turned into a monster that is eating the federal budget alive. According to the latest estimates, the United States now spends more money just paying interest on its debt than it spends on its military. Let me say that again because it matters. The country that spends more on its armed forces than the next 10 countries combined is now spending more on interest payments alone than on its entire military system. And this is only the beginning. The math is brutal and unavoidable. As old debt is refinanced at higher interest rates, the cost of interest will continue to rise. Some analysts predict that by the end of this decade, interest payments could exceed $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion every year that does not build schools, does not fix roads or bridges, does not fund hospitals, and does not create anything useful. It only pays the price of living far beyond real economic limits for decades. And if you think this is the most worrying part, we are just getting started. The second crisis moving toward collision is the retirement system crisis. The United States is sitting on 2 massive demographic time bombs called Social Security and Medicare. These programs were created in a time when there were many young workers for every retiree, when people did not live very long after retirement, and when healthcare costs were much lower than they are today. None of those conditions exist anymore. Reports from the official trustees and administrators of these programs, not from outside critics, but from government-appointed officials themselves, show that the trust funds are expected to run out within the next decade. When that happens, benefits will automatically be cut by roughly 20 to 25% unless Congress takes action. And here is the trap. Taking action means either raising taxes sharply, cutting benefits sharply, or printing even more money and making inflation worse. Every option is politically deadly. So both parties have chosen the same strategy. Ignore the problem and hope it explodes when someone else is in power. We are talking about tens of millions of Americans who depend on these programs just to survive. People who worked their entire lives with the promise that the system would be there for them. That promise is now being broken, not by accident, but by calculated political cowardice. But let me take you even deeper, because the government's financial crisis is only the surface. The third crisis is the long process of deindustrialization that has hollowed out the productive core of the United States over the past 40 years. There was a time, not that long ago, when the United States actually made things. It built some of the best cars, appliances, and machines in the world. Factories employed millions of workers in stable jobs that paid enough to buy a home, raise a family, and retire with dignity. That era did not end by chance. It ended because of deliberate economic policy choices that placed short-term corporate profits above the long-term health of the national economy. Corporations realized they could dramatically increase profits by moving production to countries with lower wages, weaker environmental rules, and fewer worker protections. And they did it on a massive scale. First, it was textiles and toys, then electronics, then automobiles, and eventually almost everything. City after city across the American Midwest turned into what we now call the Rust Belt. Closed factories, empty storefronts, communities destroyed by unemployment, poverty, addiction, and deaths of despair. And here is what supporters of globalization rarely admit. When you lose the ability to manufacture, you do not just lose jobs. You lose knowledge. You lose skills built over generations. You lose the ability to innovate around what you produce. And eventually, you lose the ability to produce at all, even if you later decide you want to. The United States learned this lesson the hard way during the pandemic. Suddenly, it needed masks and could not make them. It needed ventilators and did not have the industrial capacity to produce them quickly. The reality became impossible to ignore, even though it had been building for decades. It could not produce them. It needed basic medicines and discovered that almost all the active ingredients came from China and India. The biggest superpower in the world could not make the most basic items needed to protect its own people. And if you think this problem has been fixed, let me disappoint you. Nothing has been fixed. The dependence is still there. In fact, in many critical sectors, it has become even deeper. The United States now imports about 90% of its advanced semiconductors. These are the chips that power everything from your phone to the most advanced weapon systems. If Taiwan stopped sending chips tomorrow, the U.S. economy would slow down and freeze within weeks. And this takes us to the fourth crisis, which may be the most dangerous of all because it is linked to the role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. For 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, the dollar has been at the center of the global financial system. Countries keep their reserves in dollars. International trade is done in dollars. Oil is sold in dollars. This special position has given the United States what a French finance minister once called an exorbitant privilege. In simple terms, the U.S. can print the money the world needs and use it to buy real goods from other countries. It is like having a credit card that you never fully have to pay back because the world treats your debt as a safe asset. This privilege has allowed the United States to live far beyond its real means for decades. It has paid for endless wars, huge trade deficits, and a level of consumption that no other country could sustain. But this privilege depends on one key thing: trust. The world accepts dollars because it trusts that the United States will manage its economy responsibly and will not abuse its power. That trust is weakening, and it is weakening fast. First came the financial crisis of 2008, when the world watched Wall Street nearly destroy the global financial system through greed and fraud, and then saw the U.S. government rescue those responsible instead of punishing them. Then came massive money printing, trillions upon trillions of dollars created out of thin air, which pushed inflation onto the rest of the world. After that came the use of the dollar as a weapon through sanctions, frozen reserves, and cutting entire countries off from the global financial system. Each of these actions sent the same message to the world. The dollar is not a neutral public good for the international system. It is a political weapon that the United States will use whenever it suits its interests. And when you are the guardian of the world's reserve currency, using that position as a weapon is the fastest way to lose it. The results are already visible for anyone willing to look. Central banks around the world are reducing their dollar reserves and increasing their gold holdings at a pace not seen in decades. China and Russia have built alternative international payment systems. Trade between developing countries is increasingly done in local currencies without going through the dollar. Saudi Arabia, a key pillar of the petrodollar system, is selling oil to China in yuan. None of these changes alone destroys the dollar's position, but together they show a clear shift in direction. Once this shift gains momentum, it becomes very hard to reverse. And when the dollar loses its privileged role, and it is not a question of if, but when, the United States will have to live within its real limits for the first time in generations, that adjustment will be harsh and painful. And this brings us to what really matters. All of these economic and financial crises are happening at the same time as a deep political and institutional crisis that makes any serious response almost impossible. The political system in the United States is stuck and paralyzed. The country is more divided than at any time since the Civil War. It is not just that Democrats and Republicans disagree on solutions. They cannot even agree on what the problems are. They live in completely different information worlds with their own media, their own experts, and their own versions of reality. Congress is practically unable to pass meaningful laws on almost any major issue. Budgets are approved only after constant crises and repeated threats of government shutdowns. Appointments are blocked for years. Infrastructure projects that would benefit everyone are stopped by partisan fighting. The system is built to stall, and stall is exactly what it produces. At the same time, the Supreme Court has become another political battlefield, with decisions that often reflect ideological preferences more than any consistent reading of the law. Election results are constantly questioned, no matter who wins, and a large part of the population has lost faith that the system can represent their interests or solve their problems. This crisis of legitimacy may be more dangerous than any economic crisis, because it means that even if technical solutions exist, there is no political way to put them into action. The ship is taking on water, and the crew is too busy fighting each other to fix the leaks. The sixth crisis is social and cultural, and it is linked to what some sociologists call deaths of despair. The United States is the only developed country where life expectancy has been falling, not because of a war, not because of a pandemic, but because of suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related diseases. These are signs of a society that is deeply broken inside, of people who have lost hope, who see no future, and who are being crushed by a system that has abandoned them. The opioid epidemic has killed more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century combined, and this did not happen by chance. It was the result of pharmaceutical companies lying about how addictive their drugs were, doctors overprescribing them, regulators looking the other way, and a healthcare system that treats symptoms while ignoring root causes. Desperation is not cured with pills. It is cured with decent jobs, strong communities, and a real sense of purpose and belonging. Purpose and a sense of belonging. And that is exactly what the system has destroyed. Young Americans are less likely than their parents to get married, to have children, to buy a home, or to reach the traditional milestones of adult life. Not because they do not want to, but because they cannot. Housing costs have exploded, wages have stayed flat, and student debt is crushing an entire generation. The social contract that said work hard and you will move forward has been broken, and everyone knows it, even if very few are willing to say it out loud. And this brings us to the seventh crisis, the one that acts as a multiplier for all the others, the crisis of the country's physical infrastructure. The United States has bridges that are literally falling apart. It has power grids that fail whenever there is extreme weather. It has water systems that poison entire communities, as we saw in Flint, Michigan, and as is happening in dozens of other cities that do not get the same media attention. It has airports that look like they belong to a developing country when compared to those in Asia or Europe. It has a passenger rail system that would be embarrassing for any nation that considers itself advanced. The American Society of Civil Engineers regularly grades the country's infrastructure, and the scores are consistently close to failing. It is estimated that trillions of dollars are needed just to bring existing infrastructure up to acceptable conditions, without even talking about building the infrastructure of the future. And that money does not exist, or more accurately, it does exist, but it is spent on other things, on debt service, on military defense, on corporate subsidies, on bank bailouts. Meanwhile, China builds high-speed rail networks that connect the entire country. It builds ports, airports, and next-generation communication networks. It invests in the future while the United States consumes the past. The difference is obvious to anyone who travels between the two countries, and that gap is only getting wider. Now, if any of these crises existed on their own, the United States would have the resources and the ability to deal with it. The country is still extremely rich, still has world-class universities, and still has enviable geographic advantages. The problem is that these crises are not separate. They feed into each other in a destructive cycle that keeps accelerating. Massive debt limits the ability to invest in infrastructure and social programs. Lack of investment speeds up deindustrialization and the decline of communities. Declining communities fuel despair and social breakdown. Social breakdown freezes the political system. Political paralysis blocks any coherent response, and meanwhile, the international position of the dollar slowly erodes, threatening to remove the only mechanism that has allowed this broken system to survive. And if you thought it ended there, it does not, because there is one more factor that most analyses completely ignore, and it may be the most important of all. The United States is losing the narrative. For decades, American power rested not only on its economy and its military, but on an idea, the idea that the United States represented the future, that it was the place where dreams came true, that its system was the model everyone should follow. This story was so powerful that it convinced entire generations around the world that resisting American power was the same as resisting progress itself. That story is now falling apart. The rest of the world sees a country that cannot maintain its own infrastructure, that has mass shootings every week, that imprisons more people than any other country on earth, that cannot guarantee health care to its citizens, and that keeps choosing more and more dysfunctional leaders. The rest of the world sees videos of police brutality, images of homeless people on the streets of San Francisco, news about the opioid crisis, and asks, is this really the model we are supposed to follow? Countries that once accepted American dominance as inevitable are now looking for alternatives, not because they hate the United States, but because they no longer believe that following its leadership is in their own interest. And when an empire loses the ability to persuade, all it has left is the ability to force. And force is far more expensive, far less effective, and much harder to sustain. So what is going to happen? Let me be honest, I do not have a crystal ball, no one does, but I can describe the most likely scenarios based on historical patterns and current trends. The first scenario, the most hopeful, but also the least likely, is that the United States goes through a political awakening that brings leaders to power who are capable of deep structural reforms. This would require seriously addressing debt, rebuilding the industrial base, investing heavily in infrastructure and education, reforming a broken political system, and accepting a more modest role in the world. It is technically possible, but it would require a level of political agreement and shared sacrifice that nothing in the current situation suggests is realistic. The second scenario is managed decline. The United States slowly accepts a reduced position in the world. The dollar gradually loses its reserve status. Living standards adjust to a more modest reality, but without a total collapse. This is probably the best realistic outcome, but it requires a political elite willing to manage decline instead of denying it. And that kind of elite does not seem to exist right now. The third scenario is an acute crisis, some triggering event, a financial crash, a badly handled international conflict, or a natural disaster that exposes how fragile the system really is, sets off a chain reaction of failures that forces painful and chaotic adjustments. This scenario is dangerous, not only because of the suffering it would cause at home, but because an empire in acute crisis is unpredictable and potentially destructive for the entire world. The fourth scenario, the darkest one, is fragmentation. Political polarization reaches a point where different regions of the country simply stop recognizing the legitimacy of the federal government. This sounds extreme, but recent polls show that significant numbers of Americans on both the left and the right already see separation as a possible option. A country that cannot agree on who won an election will struggle to stay united when truly severe crises arrive. What I want you to understand is that none of these scenarios is inevitable. The future is not fixed, but the current trends, if they continue without change, point toward the most troubling outcomes, and the forces that could change these trends are weakening.